The I-Team has learned through police sources recently retested DNA on Angie's clothing led them to this inmate. The suspect was born and raised in St. Louis. He was court-martialed in 1980 for sex offenses involving children while stationed in Germany. He was again charged with sexually abusing a child in 1989. He was released and back on the streets in St. Louis in 1992, months before Angie Housman was murdered. He also lived less than 3 blocks from Angie's home at the time of the murder. He moved to Colorado, where in 2003...
It's a pretty little girl. You can see how long her hair is here. When they found her, her hair wasn't that long.
When the 9-year-old was found, tied to a tree, head covered in duct tape, nude, and starved for several days. She died a brutal death.
If I knew the person right now, hey, I'd kill him myself right now. You know, I don't know who it is. I was at work when I came home from work. They said they found DNA on her, a spot on her, and a whole body. They said they matched it out to somebody that I was supposed to know. I can't place them. Kind of heavy set. Somebody sitting there, you can tell by the neck, kind of chubby on the face.
Sources also say that person of interest has a long criminal history, is in their late 50s or early 60s, and his possible link to the case has only recently come into focus.
She stepped off the school bus and walked toward home, only 8 houses away. It was the middle of the afternoon in a quiet neighborhood where nothing like this was supposed to happen. 9-year-old Angie Housman vanished without a single witness. For 9 long days, an entire community searched. Then her body was found deep in the woods. But what truly haunts people isn't just how she disappeared, it's what investigators would later discover about the days she was missing, and why it took more than 25 years for the truth to finally surface. This is the story of a case that refused to stay buried. She was only 8 houses away from home. On a quiet November afternoon in 1993, 9-year-old Angie Housman stepped off her school bus and disappeared in broad daylight. What happened next would haunt an entire community for nearly 3 decades. Search parties combed the streets. Helicopters circled overhead. Thousands of tips poured in. Then, 9 days later, her body was discovered in a remote wooded area. But the real horror wasn't just where she was found. It was what investigators would later discover about the days she spent missing, and why the truth stayed hidden for over 25 years. This is the story of a case that refused to die until something no one saw coming finally forced it back into the light. St. Anne, Missouri, was the kind of quiet suburban neighborhood where people still left their doors unlocked and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. On November 18th, 1993, 9-year-old Angie Housman was living an ordinary life there. She was in the 4th grade at Buder Elementary School. A bright and energetic little girl who loved Barbie dolls and often talked about wanting to become a nurse's aide one day. Her family described her as cheerful and full of life, the kind of child who brought light into every room she entered. That afternoon, like every other school day, Angie got on the bus to go home. Her stop was on Wright Avenue, a short street lined with modest homes. From the bus stop, it was only about 8 houses to her front door. Usually, one of the neighborhood mothers would be waiting at the stop to watch the children get off safely. But on that particular day, no one was there. Angie stepped off the bus and began walking the short distance toward her house. Within minutes, she was gone. When she didn't come home at the usual time, her family started to worry. At first, they thought maybe she had stopped to play with a friend or lost track of time. But as the minutes turned into hours and the sky grew dark, panic set in. By evening, Angie's family reported her missing to the St. Anne Police Department. Officers arrived quickly and began asking questions. They checked with neighbors and friends. They searched the immediate area around her home and the bus stop, but there was no sign of her. From the very beginning, police were certain this was not a case of a child, simply wandering off or running away. Angie was only 9 years old. She knew her way home. She had no history of disappearing or getting into trouble. Something was very wrong. The news spread fast through the quiet neighborhood. People who had known Angie since she was little couldn't believe what they were hearing. One neighbor later said, "She was a sweet, innocent child. The whole neighborhood loved her. No one could imagine something like this happening in broad daylight like that." By nightfall, what started as a missing child report had already begun to feel like something much darker. Police officers walked the streets with flashlights, calling Angie's name. Neighbors came out of their homes, offering to help search the nearby yards and empty lots. The ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood had been shattered. Inside the Housman home, the fear was overwhelming. Angie's mother and stepfather tried to stay calm for the sake of their other children, but the longer the hours stretched without any news, the harder it became. They kept hoping their daughter would walk through the door at any moment, that there would be some simple explanation, but deep down, they knew something terrible had happened. As the first night passed with no sign of Angie, the St. Parable had happened, and police department realized they were dealing with something far more serious than a typical missing child case. They requested assistance from larger agencies. What had begun as a quiet evening in a peaceful suburb was quickly turning into one of the most intense missing person investigations the area had ever seen. No one in St. Anne could have predicted that this ordinary Thursday afternoon would mark the beginning of a mystery that would last for more than a quarter of a century. As night fell on November 18th, 1993, the St. Anne Police Department realized they were no longer dealing with a simple missing child report. Angie Housman had been gone for several hours, and every minute that passed made the situation more urgent. Officers quickly organized a large-scale search operation that would continue through the night and into the following days. What began as a local effort soon grew far beyond what anyone had expected. Within hours, the search expanded dramatically. Hundreds of police officers from multiple departments joined the effort. The FBI was brought in to assist. The Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis, a specialized team usually called in for the most serious crimes, was activated. Helicopters equipped with searchlights flew over the neighborhood and surrounding areas, scanning backyards, empty lots, and wooded patches. Search dogs were deployed to pick up any possible scent. By the next morning, the scale of the operation had become even larger. Thousands of volunteers from the community showed up, wanting to help find the missing 9-year-old. People from St. Anne and neighboring towns walked through fields, checked drainage ditches, and searched along roadsides. The search stretched across 2 counties as investigators considered every possible direction Angie could have gone. It was one of the largest missing person searches the St. Louis area had seen in years. Despite the massive effort, clear answers remained elusive. Police received thousands of tips from the public. Some seemed promising at first, others were clearly not helpful. As the days went on, the volume of calls became overwhelming. Many people contacted authorities with their own theories, but very few provided information that could actually be verified or pursued. Former St. Charles County Police Chief Bob Schrader, who was involved in the early stages of the investigation, later recalled the flood of tips that came in during those first days. "We received a lot of calls," he said. "People would say, 'That's my ex-husband.' You wouldn't believe the number of people who called in and said that." The sheer number of false or misleading leads created a difficult challenge for investigators. Every tip had to be checked, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Detectives worked around the clock, following up on reports that ultimately led nowhere. The frustration grew as each day passed without any solid evidence pointing to what had happened to Angie. Meanwhile, the community remained deeply involved. Neighbors continued to search on their own. Local businesses printed flyers with Angie's photograph. Churches held prayer vigils. The story dominated local news, and many residents who had never met Angie felt personally affected by her disappearance. The quiet suburban streets of St. Anne had been transformed into the center of a massive, coordinated search effort. As the search entered its 3rd and 4th days, the mood began to shift. What started with hope and urgency slowly gave way to a growing sense of dread. Investigators knew that, with each passing hour, the chances of finding Angie safe were slipping away. Still, they continued working without rest, determined to follow every possible lead. The scale of the operation reflected how seriously authorities were taking the case. This was not treated as a routine missing child report. From the very beginning, police believed something serious had happened to Angie. The involvement of the FBI and the Major Case Squad showed that this was considered a high-priority investigation from the start. Yet despite the enormous resources dedicated to the search, the answers remained out of reach. Angie had vanished in broad daylight, in a neighborhood where everyone knew one another, and still no one had seen anything that could explain her disappearance. The lack of witnesses and the absence of clear evidence made the case increasingly difficult as time went on. By the end of the first week, the search had covered an enormous amount of ground across 2 counties. Volunteers had walked countless miles. Helicopters had scanned miles of terrain. Thousands of tips had been received and investigated. But Angie was still missing, and the questions only continued to grow. After nearly 9 days of relentless searching, the worst fear of the community was realized. On the morning of November 27th, 1993, a hunter walking through the Bush Wildlife Conservation Area in St. Charles County made a devastating discovery. In a remote wooded section of the preserve, not far from Highway 94, he found the body of 9-year-old Angie Housman. The location was several miles away from where Angie had last been seen getting off the school bus. The area was heavily wooded and relatively isolated, making it difficult for search teams to cover thoroughly in the early days of the investigation. When police arrived at the scene, they immediately secured the area and began the difficult process of confirming the identity of the child they had been searching for since November 18th. For the officers and investigators who had spent the past 9 days hoping for a different outcome, the discovery brought a heavy sense of sorrow. What had started as a desperate search for a missing child had now become a criminal investigation. Police worked carefully at the scene, documenting everything they could find while trying to piece together what had happened during the days Angie had been missing. News of the discovery spread quickly through St. Anne and the surrounding communities. What had been a neighborhood gripped by worry and hope was now overcome by grief and shock. Many residents who had participated in the search or followed the story closely were left devastated. For Angie's family, the confirmation brought an unimaginable pain that would stay with them for years to come. In the days and weeks that followed the discovery, the community began to change in visible ways. Parents who had once allowed their children to walk home from school alone started implementing new rules. Many families adopted what became known as the buddy system, requiring children to travel in groups or be accompanied by an adult. The sense of safety that had once defined the quiet suburban streets was deeply shaken. What happened to Angie made many families realize that even in familiar neighborhoods, danger could appear without warning. The case left a lasting mark on everyone involved in the investigation. Years later, St. Charles County Prosecutor Tim Lomar would reflect on the impact of that day, saying, "This is one of those cases we will never forget. It happened right during our watch." For the police officers, volunteers, and neighbors who had spent days searching for Angie, the discovery brought a painful sense of closure mixed with many unanswered questions. The investigation shifted from a search and rescue operation to a full criminal investigation. Detectives began examining the scene for any evidence that could help explain what had happened during those 9 days. The shock rippled far beyond St. Anne. Local news stations covered the story extensively, and many people who had never met Angie felt connected to the case. The image of a young child disappearing so close to home stayed with the community for a long time. Schools and parent groups began having serious conversations about child safety, something that had rarely been a major concern before. As the initial wave of grief settled, a quiet determination took hold. Many residents wanted answers. They wanted to understand how something like this could happen in their neighborhood and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. The case had changed the way people in St. Anne looked at their community and at the safety of their children. If you're new to the channel and want to hear more stories about cases that shaped communities and tested the limits of justice, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell. Your support helps us continue telling these important stories with the respect they deserve. After the initial shock of the discovery, investigators threw everything they had into solving the case. In the months that followed, police pursued every possible lead with determination. They interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on tips from the public, and carefully examined the evidence collected at the scene. But as time passed, the momentum began to fade. What had been an intense, high-priority investigation slowly turned into a cold case. Detectives worked tirelessly to identify potential suspects. They looked into individuals who had prior records involving children, as well as anyone who had been in the area around the time Angie disappeared. Several people were brought in for questioning and thoroughly investigated. Some had criminal histories that made them persons of interest. Others lived or worked nearby and could not immediately be ruled out. Yet one by one, each suspect was eventually cleared after alibis were verified or evidence failed to connect them to the crime. At one point, investigators even received a confession from a man already in prison for another crime. For a brief moment, it seemed like the case might finally be solved. But when detectives examined the details of his statement, they quickly realized it did not match the known facts of the investigation. The confession was false, and the man was ruled out as a suspect. Despite having some physical evidence from the scene, including a partial fingerprint on a piece of duct tape and a small DNA sample, investigators faced a major obstacle. The forensic technology available in the late 1990s and early 2000s was simply not advanced enough to extract usable information from the limited samples they had collected. The evidence sat in storage, waiting for science to catch up. For those who worked the case day after day, the lack of progress was deeply frustrating. One of the investigators who carried the weight of the case for many years was former St. Charles County Police Chief Bob Schroeder. He remained involved with the investigation for nearly 2 decades. Even after he retired in 2013, the case stayed with him. Before leaving, he made a point to speak with the detective who would take over, urging him not to let the case be forgotten. Schrader later spoke about the emotional toll the investigation took on him and his team.
How many times I come home and I lay in bed and I stare at the ceiling and I'm talking to myself, and my wife nudges me, go to sleep, you're not going to solve it tonight.
For 20 years, the case remained unsolved. New leads occasionally surfaced, but none of them led anywhere meaningful. The file grew thicker with reports, interviews, and dead ends. Technology continued to improve in other areas of law enforcement, but the critical break investigators needed still had not come. Angie's family and the community were left living with unanswered questions year after year. The passage of time did not make the case any easier for those who had been there from the beginning. Every anniversary brought renewed attention from the media and fresh pain for the family. Investigators who had worked the case in the early days watched as new detectives were assigned and then moved on to other investigations. Through it all, the core team of people who refused to give up continued to hope that one day, something would change. By the time 2013 arrived and Bob Schrader retired, the case had already been cold for many years, yet he still believed it could be solved. His message to the next generation of investigators was clear: keep going. Do not let this case become just another unsolved file gathering dust. For more than 2.5 decades, the truth remained hidden in the dark. The people who worked the case never stopped believing that answers would eventually come. They just didn't know how long they would have to wait, or what it would finally take to bring those answers into the light. For more than 25 years, the case of Angie Housman remained one of the most frustrating and painful unsolved investigations in the St. Louis area. Despite the dedication of many investigators, including former police chief Bob Schrader, who carried the case for 2 decades, traditional methods of investigation had reached their limit. Leads dried up, suspects were cleared, and the physical evidence collected in 1993 sat in storage, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist. By 2018, a new generation of investigators decided it was time to take another look. A dedicated task force was formed specifically to re-examine the old evidence with fresh eyes and, more importantly, with the benefit of modern forensic science. What had once been impossible was now within reach. The key piece of evidence was a small sample taken from the pink trim of Angie's underwear, which had been carefully preserved since the day her body was discovered. In the 1990s, DNA technology was still in its early stages. The sample was simply too small and too degraded for the tools available at the time to produce a usable profile. But by 2018 and 2019, forensic laboratories had developed far more sensitive methods for extracting and analyzing DNA, even from very old and limited samples. When the crime lab processed the evidence again using these advanced techniques, they achieved something remarkable. They were able to develop a full male DNA profile from the pink trim of the underwear. This profile was then entered into the national DNA database known as CODIS. Almost immediately, it produced a match. The statistical probability of that match was staggering, 1 in 58.1 trillion. In practical terms, it meant there was virtually no chance that the DNA belonged to anyone other than the person identified in the database. After more than a quarter of a century, science had finally given investigators the answer they had been searching for. St. Charles County prosecutor Tim Lomar, who had been involved with the case in various capacities over the years, later described the breakthrough in simple terms.
it's about much more than just the DNA analysis, but in particular, the finding that was the linchpin for us was good science, good lab work, and just good luck. It's like finding a needle in a haystack.
For the investigators who had worked on the case for many years, the moment was both relieving and emotional. Some of them had lived with the unanswered questions for most of their careers. Others had inherited the case from predecessors who had carried the burden before them. Suddenly, after decades of dead ends, there was finally a solid lead, one backed by the overwhelming power of modern DNA analysis. The breakthrough did more than just identify a potential suspect. It validated the years of work that had gone into preserving and storing the evidence. It proved that even when a case goes cold, it doesn't have to stay that way forever. The combination of careful evidence preservation from NEAT in 1993 and the scientific advancements of 2019 had created the perfect conditions for a breakthrough that no one could have predicted when the investigation first began. As news of the DNA match spread within the investigative team, the atmosphere shifted from quiet persistence to cautious hope. After spending so many years in the dark, they finally had something concrete to work with. The next step would be to locate the man whose DNA had been found at the scene and determine what role he had played in Angie's disappearance. For the first time in more than 25 years, the case that had once seemed impossible to solve was moving forward again. Technology had done what human effort alone could not achieve. And for the people who had never stopped believing that answers would eventually come, that moment marked the beginning of the end of a very long wait. After the crime lab developed a male DNA profile from the pink trim of the underwear, investigators moved quickly to identify whose DNA it belonged to. The profile was run through the national COD at APUS, and within a short time, it produced a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Earl Webster Cox. At the time of the match in 2019, Cox was 61 years old. What made the discovery even more significant was his connection to the area where Angie had lived. Investigators learned that years earlier, Cox had lived only about 3 blocks away from Angie's home on Wright Avenue. He was familiar with the neighborhood and would have known the area well. Further background checks revealed that Cox had a criminal history involving children dating back to his time serving in the U.S. Air Force. After leaving the military, his record continued to show repeated offenses against children. By 2003, he had been arrested as part of a larger federal investigation into a child pornography distribution network. At the time the DNA match was made in 2019, Cox was already being held in a federal prison in North Carolina under civil commitment as a sexually dangerous person. The DNA evidence gave investigators the break they had been waiting for. On June 5, 2019, St. Charles County Prosecutor Tim Lomar held a press conference to announce that Earl Webster Cox was being formally charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping in connection with Angie Housman's death. After more than 25 years, the case that had gone cold was now moving forward with an identified suspect. Lomar spoke about the significance of the development, saying, "We believe that science has led us to the right person. This is a significant step forward after more than 25 years." For the investigators who had worked on the case for many years, the announcement brought a complex mix of emotions. There was relief that progress had finally been made, but also the sobering reality that it had taken more than a quarter of a century to reach this point. Some of the original detectives who had responded to the missing person, call in 1893, were no longer with the department. Others had carried the weight of the unsolved case for most of their careers. The news also sent shockwaves through the community. Many residents of St. Anne remembered the fear and grief that had followed Angie's disappearance. Learning that the person charged had once lived so close to her home added another layer of pain for those who had known her. The case that had once seemed impossible to solve was now entering a new phase, one that would eventually bring it into a courtroom, because Cox was already in federal custody in North Carolina. Arrangements were made to have him brought back to Missouri to face the new charges. The investigation that had once relied on door-to-door searches and thousands of tips was now focused on building a strong case based on the DNA evidence and Cox's known background. The charging of Earl Webster Cox marked the end of the long period of uncertainty that had defined the case for so many years. While there were still many questions that needed to be answered in court, investigators finally had a clear direction. Science had done what traditional detective work alone could not accomplish. After spending more than 25 years in the dark, the case was now moving steadily toward resolution. After Earl Webster Cox was charged in June 2019, the case moved slowly through the legal system. Cox was already being held in federal custody in North Carolina, so arrangements had to be made to bring him to Missouri to face the new charges. For over a year, prosecutors and defense attorneys worked through pre-trial proceedings. Then, in August 2020, a major development occurred. Rather than going to trial, Cox made the decision to plead guilty. In exchange for admitting his involvement in Angie Housman's death, he was offered a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. This agreement meant he would avoid facing the death penalty. On August 20th, 2020, Cox appeared in a St. Charles County courtroom to formally enter his guilty plea. What stood out most to those present in the courtroom was not just the plea itself, but the way Cox behaved during the hearing. As the judge asked him a series of questions to confirm that he understood the charges and was making the decision voluntarily, Cox answered each one in a calm, flat tone. There was no visible emotion on his face. He spoke as if he were discussing something ordinary, showing neither hesitation or any sign of regret. St. Charles County prosecutor Tim Lamar, who was present during the hearing, later described Cox's demeanor in clear terms. He answered the judge's questions in a matter-of-fact manner, Lamar said, with no emotion or remorse whatsoever. The prosecutor did not hold back in his assessment of Cox's attitude. He described him as a coward, someone who had taken a life, but showed no courage or accountability, even when finally facing the consequences in court. For the family members who had waited nearly 27 years for this moment, watching Cox respond so coldly was difficult to witness. Some had hoped for more emotion, or perhaps even an apology. Instead, they saw a man who appeared completely detached from the pain he had caused. Despite the lack of remorse shown by Cox, the guilty plea brought a sense of finality to the legal process. By accepting responsibility in court, he removed the need for a long and painful trial that would have required the family to relive the details of the case. The agreement ensured that Cox would spend the rest of his life in prison with no chance of ever being released. For the investigators who had worked on the case for many years, the courtroom proceedings marked the end of a long journey. Some had been involved since the beginning in 1993. Others had joined later, but still carried the weight of the unsolved case. Seeing Cox finally acknowledge his actions in front of a judge provided a measure of closure, even if it came with the painful realization of how long it had taken to reach this point. The guilty plea also meant that many questions about the case would never be fully answered in open court. Because there was no trial, the public would not hear all the evidence that prosecutors had gathered. However, the most important outcome had been achieved. Cox would never be free again. As the hearing concluded and Cox was led out of the courtroom, the reality of the situation settled over everyone involved. After more than 26 years of uncertainty, the legal system had finally delivered a resolution. It was not the outcome anyone had wanted in 1993, but it was the resolution the family and investigators had fought for over so many years. If you want to see how Angie's family reacted when they finally faced the man responsible in court, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for the next part of the story. For nearly 27 years, Angie Housman's family had lived with unanswered questions and unimaginable grief. On August 20th, 2020, some of them finally had the chance to face the man responsible in a courtroom. After more than 2.5 decades of waiting, they were present as Earl Webster Cox formally admitted his involvement in Angie's death. The atmosphere in the St. Charles County courtroom was heavy. Family members who had spent years wondering what had happened to Angie now sat just feet away from the man who had taken her life. For many of them, this was the first time they had seen Cox in person. The moment they had waited for so long had finally arrived, but it brought with it a complicated mix of emotions. One of the family members who spoke during the proceedings was Angie's aunt, Sandra Hill. As Cox answered the judge's questions in his calm, detached manner, she listened to him acknowledge what he had done. Her reaction was one of deep anger and pain. She later said, "She didn't have a chance. She was only 9 years old. I call him a monster." Her words captured the overwhelming sense of injustice that the family had carried for so many years. Angie had been a young child with her whole life ahead of her, and yet she had been robbed of any opportunity to grow up, to experience life, or to achieve the dreams she had talked about. Hearing Cox speak so emotionlessly about his actions only deepened the family's sense of loss. There was one person who was deeply missed on that day, Angie's mother, Diane, had passed away in 2016 after a battle with cancer. She had lived for more than 2 decades without knowing who was responsible for her daughter's death. She never got to see the day when science finally identified the person who had taken Angie from her. For the rest of the family, her absence was deeply felt. They knew how much she had suffered and how desperately she had wanted answers that never came during her lifetime. The guilty plea and sentencing brought a measure of closure, but it could not erase the years of pain the family had endured. They had raised Angie, loved her, and watched her grow into a bright and happy 9-year-old. Then, in an instant, she was gone. For 27 years, they had lived with the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened or who was responsible. Now, at least, they had an answer. Still, the resolution came at a heavy cost. Many family members had spent the best years of their lives carrying grief and anger. Some had passed away without ever seeing justice served. Others, like Sandra Hill, had to find the strength to face the man responsible and speak about the niece they had lost. The courtroom may have provided legal closure, but the emotional wounds would remain for a lifetime. As Cox was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the family was left to process what this moment truly meant. It was the end of a long and painful chapter, but it was also a reminder of everything they had lost along the way. Angie would never come back, her mother would never know the truth, and the family would forever carry the memory of a little girl who deserved so much more than what was taken from her. For those who had fought for answers for nearly 3 decades, this day represented both an ending and a painful acknowledgement of how long justice had been delayed. While Angie Housman's family carried the weight of grief and unanswered questions for nearly 27 years, there was another group of people who refused to let the case be forgotten. Behind the scenes, a dedicated team of investigators, prosecutors, and forensic experts continued working on the case long after it had faded from public attention. One of the most committed individuals was former St. Charles County Police Chief Bob Schrader. He had been involved in the investigation almost from the beginning and spent nearly 20 years working on the case. Even after he retired in 2013, the unsolved disappearance and death of Angie Housman stayed with him. When the DNA breakthrough finally came in 2019, Schrader was deeply moved. He described the news as the best news I've had in a very long time. His words reflected the quiet determination that defined so many of the people who worked on this case. For 2 decades, Schrader had carried the responsibility of an investigation that seemed to have no end in sight. He had followed leads, reviewed evidence, and encouraged his team never to stop looking for answers. Even in retirement, he continued to hope that one day the case would be solved. Prosecutor Tim Laumer and the team of investigators who worked alongside him showed the same kind of persistence. They continued to review the case files and push for new forensic testing, even during the years when the case had gone completely cold with the public. While other high-profile cases came and went, they kept Angie's file active. They believed that advances in technology might one day provide the break they needed. That belief was eventually rewarded. In 2018 and 2019, when a new task force was assembled to re-examine the old evidence, it was the result of years of quiet advocacy by people who had never stopped caring about the case. Forensic scientists and crime lab technicians played a crucial role in this process. They took evidence that had been collected and stored since 1993 and applied the latest DNA analysis techniques to samples that had previously been too small or too degraded to test effectively. The work required patience, precision, and a deep commitment to justice. These experts knew that even the smallest piece of evidence could hold the key to solving a case that had remained unsolved for more than a quarter of a century. Their willingness to revisit old evidence with new technology was what ultimately made the breakthrough possible. For many of the investigators and forensic professionals involved, the case represented more than just another file on their desk. It was a reminder of why they had chosen their careers in the first place. They had seen the impact the case had on Angie's family and on the community. They understood that behind every piece of evidence was a real person whose life had been cut short and a family left searching for answers. The persistence of these individuals over so many years serves as a powerful example of what it takes to solve cold cases. While public attention may fade and new cases may demand immediate resources, there are always people who continue working quietly in the background, refusing to give up. In Angie Housman's case, it was this combination of long-term dedication from investigators like Bob Schrader and the scientific advancements supported by forensic teams that finally brought the case out of the darkness. Their efforts proved that even when justice is delayed, it does not have to be denied as long as there are people willing to keep fighting for it. On August 20th, 2020, Earl Webster Cox stood in a St. Charles County courtroom and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After pleading guilty earlier that day, he was given the maximum sentence allowed under the agreement he had made with processors. For Angie Housman's family, the moment marked the end of a legal process that had taken nearly 27 years to complete. 4 years later, in December 2024, Cox died while still serving his sentence. According to the Missouri Department of Corrections, he passed away from natural causes at a medical facility. His death brought a final, quiet conclusion to a case that had once consumed so much attention and caused so much pain. But the story of Angie Housman is about more than just one man's fate. It has become a powerful example of how far forensic science has come in solving cold cases. What once seemed impossible, identifying a suspect from a tiny decades-old DNA sample, became possible because of advancements in technology and the determination of people who refused to stop trying. This case showed that even when evidence is old and leads have gone cold, answers can still be found if the evidence is preserved and science is given the chance to do its work. There are important lessons we can take from what happened here. First is the value of persistence. Investigators like Bob Schrader and prosecutors like Tim Lomar continued working on this case for years. Even when public interest faded and new cases demanded their attention, their refusal to give up eventually made all the difference. Second is the critical importance of preserving evidence. The small sample from Angie's clothing that eventually solved the case had been carefully stored since 1993. Without that careful preservation, the breakthrough in 2019 would never have been possible. Perhaps the most important lesson is one of hope. While justice in this case came far too late for Angie and for her mother, who passed away in 2016 without ever knowing who was responsible, it did eventually arrive. The family finally received answers after nearly 3 decades of waiting. That kind of closure, however delayed, matters deeply to those who are left behind. What do you think about cases like this? Do you believe that advances in DNA technology will continue to help solve more cold cases in the future? Or do you think there are still limits to what science can achieve? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Angie Housman was only 9 years old when she was taken from her family and her community. For almost 27 years, her loved ones lived with questions that had no answers. Today, because of the persistence of investigators, the progress of forensic science, and the courage of a family that never stopped wanting the truth, they finally have some measure of peace. Justice arrived late, but it did not fail to arrive. If this story moved you, or made you think about the importance of never giving up on the truth, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.